Okay. Okay, good morning. I'm hoping everyone is doing well. I'd like to apologize for the delay. Small technical problems. So I'm hoping you forgive me for that. Now, today we are going to continue what we discussed or what we were discussing last week. I'm hoping today's class would be more lively than it used to be. Why? Because what we're treating today is very, very important. One of the most important parts of reproduction and growth in plants. Before we ended the class last week, we looked at agents of pollination. Let me repeat what you were asked to do. So in the course of the lesson, when you have a question, you can raise up your hand using the raise hand button. I would see it and answer your question or any input that you need to make. And if you have any personal message or you don't want to speak, but rather send. Okay. Boachi, can you hear me now? Okay. So if you can't speak, but rather you want to send a message, I would read it out and answer if it's a question, I answer your question. Thank you. Okay, so we would continue. Now, as I said, looking at what we did last week, where we ended on the agents of pollination. We ended on agents of pollination. We looked at what these agents are. Then we defined them as factors responsible for the transfer of pollen grains to the stigma. We define them as the transfer of factors or elements responsible for the transfer of pollen grains to the stigma. Now, these agents, you can have them there: wind, insects, water, birds, bats. Sometimes we add human because we also form another most important agent of pollination. Why? Because we try and visit various plants for flowers and we disturb them. Now, in the course of this disturbance, it causes pollination to be possible. Now, we are going to look at these agents, look at them, how they aid or they are responsible for pollination. Now, the two most important agents are wind and insect. Very, very, very important and very common. They are the most common that we ever see. Now, these two most common agents, wind and insect. Now, insects are more attracted to flowers. They are more attracted to the color, to the scent, and to the nectar inside. With the wind, it depends on how strong or how weak you find the wind blowing. Now, flowers are not too strong. Because they form the shoot system. They are not. They don't have a strong root. They don't have a strong grinding. You don't have a strong stock to hold them. so they are not too strong. But the plant itself is strong. But the flower, because it's hanging, the wind can control their movement. Now, flowers that are pollinated by wind alone are also referred to as anemophilous flowers. Anemophilous flowers. Flowers that are pollinated by the wind. Flowers that have features that can be pollinated by wind are called anemophilous flowers. And those that are pollinated by insects are called entomophilous flowers. So two things we have here. Those that are pollinated by the wind are called anemophilous flowers, and those that are pollinated by insects are called entomophilous flowers. Now, these two most common agents, we'll take the two out and look at them on their own. Features that enables them to be pollinated by wind or by insects. We'll look at those in the next slides. Okay, so in aquatic habitat or medium, water currents are important as pollinating agents. Now you note here that I didn't use the word water, but water current. So the movement of the water is a water current. So that enables or aids pollination. So when pollen grain lands on water surface, it's being carried along by water current. The water is there, but the current carries the water from the pollen grains from one point to another. The next one, fruit-eating bats and birds are important pollinators, for fruit trees. You know the bat. You've seen bats before. If you've not seen some before, you can go to your search engine and see how the bat looks like. Now, most bats are fruit-eating animals. They like fruits a lot. They like sweet plants. So, in doing so, they enable or they help pollination to take place. Now, these birds also form a medium through which they can cause pollination to occur. Take an example, any kind of bird that visits a flower. Now, the moment it steps on the flower, the feet of the bird steps on the anther. Now, you have these pollen grains being sticky, then they stick to the feet of the birds. The birds move from one point to another. They move to another flower. Then these pollen grains are able to stick to or stick on the stigma of another flower. Pollination has taken place. The next point. Flowers like hibiscus are pollinated by hummingbirds. Well, I just made mention of that. And cosmos by bees. So the same principle where these pollen grains are able to get stuck to the birds is the same way they are stuck to the bees. Now, the pollen grains can even get stuck to the wings of these organisms. The moment they move to a different flower, at the point where they are taking off or at the point where they are landing on the flower, they shake off their wings and the pollen grains may fall on the stigma of the flower, then pollination has taken place. Now, the last point gives you these pollen grains can accidentally fall by gravity on the stigma of a flower. Fall by gravity. The word there, fall by gravity. Now, this fall by gravity, as you know, gravity is the force of attraction between two bodies in contact with each other. So, at the point where the pollen grains they are falling, gravity brings the two together. That is, it brings the pollen grains to the stigma. Okay. If you have any question from what I just said, let me know. Okay, so as I said, We are going to take these two most common pollinators of flower. That is the wind pollinated flowers and the insect pollinated flowers. In other words, anemophilous flowers, that is for the wind, and entomophilous flowers, that is for the insects. Now, these are two different things. Now, we are going to look at the differences between these two. Point one. The flowers are small and inconspicuous. The flowers are small and inconspicuous. So features that will enable you to know that this is a wind pollinated flowers is that the flowers are small and inconspicuous. Now, what this inconspicuous means is that they are not easily visible. They are not too visible. They are not too easily visible, or they are not too visible. Now, when you go to the insects, they are large and conspicuous. So they are large and easily, you can see them, easily visible. Point number two, petals are not brightly colored. So for the wind, because they are pollinated by wind, color is not their main emphasis. So their petals are not brightly colored as compared to the insect pollinated flowers that they are brightly colored petals to attract insects to the flower. So as you can see, these features enables them the kind of agent to factor on the flower. Point number three. For the wind pollinated flowers, wind, so they don't scent. The wind doesn't require any scent to pollinate flowers. So they are not usually also scented. They are not scented. They don't have any kind of scent or any kind of smell. But with the insect pollinated flowers, they are usually scented. Oh, Infinix was hot 8. Okay, so they are not usually scented for the wind pollinated flowers. Then with the insect pollinated flowers, because insects visit the flower, they pick up the scent by the flower. So they are usually scented. So this is a feature that would enable you to know that this flower is an insect pollinated flower or a wind pollinated flower. Point number 4. Point 4. For the wind pollinated flowers, they possess no nectar. So they have no nectar. Compared to the insect pollinated flowers, they have nectar present for insects to take the nectar out of. Point number 5. Because the wind, the anemophilous flowers are pollinated by the wind, they have large feathery stigma projecting from the flower. So their stigma is large and feathery, and it is projecting from the flower. So you can see them. The stigma has raised up, or it has moved up above the other floral halls, like the petals, for you to see. Either it has moved up or it's inside, but you can see them inside. Compared to the insect pollinated flowers that they have compact sticky stigma, usually enclosed in the flower. So their stigma is not high above the floral part or high above the petals, but it's inside, not too much inside. It's not easily seen compared to the wind pollinated flowers. The next point. They have small, smooth, and light pollen grains. That is for the wind pollinated flowers. They are small, smooth, and light pollen grains. So this feature enables the pollen grains to be carried easily by the currents of the wind. But with the insect pollinated flowers, they are large, heavy, rough pollen grains. Large, rough, heavy pollen grains. So these are two, you have to note the difference. They are all features of what? This kind of pollinator, plant pollinators. The next point, now with the wind pollinated flowers, because they are pollinated by the wind and they are small, smooth and light, many pollen grains are produced per anther. Many pollen grains are produced per anther as compared to the insect pollinated flowers where they are large, rough, and heavy. So they produce just a few number of pollen grains per anther. So one anther, if for example, you have a wind pollinated flower here at one side and an insect pollinated flower at the other end. Now, the anther of the wind pollinated flower will produce many pollen grains per that one anther compared to that of the insect pollinated flower that will produce few or fewer pollen grains per anther. Then the last feature between the two is that with the wind pollinated flowers, the stamens are long. They have long stamen. They have long stamen, thin filament, and a large anther that swings easily in the wind. So the stamen is long. That means that the stamen is let me see, maintain the word long. The stamen is long. The filament that holds the anther in place is very thin, but the anther on top is large. So when the wind blows, it's able to shake the anther and release the pollen grains, as compared to the insect pollinated flowers that they are having a short stamen. So more or less it's buried in the flower or it's enclosed in the flower. Now the filament, what holds the anther in place, is stout, and the anther is usually enclosed in the flower. So you don't normally see them out of the flower. Now these are all features of adaptation of wind pollinated flowers and insect pollinated flowers. Don't be confused when you see give 5 features of anemophilous flowers or 5 features of entomophilous flowers. Anemophilous means that they are wind possessed or wind featured. If you remember, okay, that was biology student. Let me stick to it. So the anemone there talks about wind. Then the entomology. Ento talks about insects. So don't get confused when you see this instead of the wind pollinated flowers or insect pollinated flowers. Okay, any question from this point?
Say,
Yes.
please, can I conclude that insect pollinated flowers produce few pollen grains because their percentage of being pollinated is high compared to that of the anemophilous flowers?
You are saying that, can you say?
I'm saying that the entomophilous flowers produce few pollen grains because naturally their percentage of being pollinated by living organisms is high than that of the anemophilous flowers.
It's I wouldn't say this is substantial. Why am I saying that? Every time the wind is blowing, now in the evening, insects might not visit the flower, or during the night, insects might not visit the flower, so the flower will be there dormant. But with the wind, it's always blowing, so every time it's occurring. Now with the insects, when you say few pollen grains, now it's a natural thing that occurs. A natural phenomenon. It's not that the insects are, because the insects visit it more often, that is how come they produce few.
Okay.
So, like, I can't say that that is why it happens, but it's natural for them to occur that way.
Okay.
Okay. So if you have any question, then let me know again. Okay. Okay. So let's continue. Now I want to look at the next step that proceeds after pollination. What happens after pollination has taken place? Now, fertilization in flowering plants. Now, it's one most important aspect in the life of plants, specifically with the flowers. Fertilization. All organisms, even we human beings, one of the most important processes that takes place in us is fertilization. Without fertilization, I wouldn't be here. Funny enough, you all wouldn't have been here. So this fertilization occurs after pollination has taken place. After pollination has taken place, the next preceding stage is fertilization. After pollination, the next preceding stage is fertilization. Now, in our previous studies, we defined fertilization as a fusion of the nucleus of the male gamete with the nucleus of the female gamete to form a zygote. I also mentioned that if you define it as a fusion of the male gamete and the female gamete to form a zygote, it's okay, but it's rather the nucleus or the nuclei that fuses together to form the zygote, not the gamete itself. Okay, Boache Brigetta, if I have your name, if I got your name right, is asking whether any flower which is not scented, is there any flower which is not scented but can be pollinated by the wind? Now, if you notice, the answer is yes. If you notice, let me go back so that you see what I'm trying to say. If you notice, I use the word usually. It doesn't mean that they are not scented at all. They don't have any kind of scent. They don't. It's not that they don't have any kind of scent. They have. It's like I remember one time I asked my students to go and buy me food. Then they were like, "Sir, this place, the food, it has no scent." But meanwhile, people to eat. So it's not the fact that it has no scent to not be pollinated by the wind.
Say,
Yes. Hello.
say,
Yes.
I can hear you well.
You can't hear me well. Can you hear me?
Yes, say.
Your line is breaking. Hello.
Say, same thing happens to you.
Really?
Yes, say.
Bridgetta or
Bridget,
okay. Try and understand what is going on. It would be a network problem. So try and bear with me. Thank you very much.
okay, say.
So with your question, as I said, the word usually there doesn't mean that it's not scented. So the answer to your question is that yes, there are flowers that they have, they are scented, that they can be pollinated by the wind. Now, understand that these are all features. So you might not find all these features in one flower. You can find more than 5 in one flower. Okay. So let me continue. So as I was saying, This fertilization is a fusion of the nucleus of the male gamete and the nucleus of the female gamete to form a zygote. The most important thing here is the nucleus, not the gamete itself. The gamete is important, but the nuclei fuse together to form the zygote. Now, in flowering plants, this process, that is the fertilization process, takes place in the ovule. In flowering plants, the fertilization process takes place in the ovule. Now, during the process of fertilization in flowering plants, fertilization takes place in the ovule takes place twice, hence double fertilization. I'm going to explain this. Now, in living organisms like human beings, animals, you normally undergo one fertilization. That's all. When the nucleus of the gametes fuse, that's all. Normal fertilization. But in plants, specifically flowers, they undergo two forms of fertilization. They undergo two forms, so it's referred to as double fertilization in flowering plants. Now, this process it occurs in steps. I'll give you the steps, after which I'm going to play a video for you to watch. Now, with this fertilization, double fertilization, the steps are in a way that when you start and you miss the next step, but you're able to continue with the rest, you mark the first step that you had correct, the rest are all wrong because you can't mix them up. So let's say the steps are 10. What I have in the next slide, there are 10 steps. You're able to give step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, then step 5, then step 6. You go and replace step 6 with step 8, and then continue. From step 1 to step 5 will mark you 1, 1, 1, 1 mark. The rest are all wrong. So should in case you start step 1, you have step 1, the rest you place step 3 at step 2. We mark everything wrong because the rest are all wrong. So you should be more particular about how this fertilization occurs in flowering plants. Okay. Now we need to understand how this fertilization takes place. Now we define pollination as the transfer of matured pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of a flower. So the moment the pollen grains lands on the stigma, this fertilization takes place on the gymnasium. That's either it occurs on the carpel or pistil. And we've established that the carpel or pistil is made up of the stigma, the style, the ovary, and the ovule. So that is where this process will occur. Now we need to know, as we made mention, that this fertilization takes place in the ovule. So we need to know what the ovule is made up of, or what it entails. Now, the ovary contains one or more ovules. We've already established that earlier on. Now, each ovule consists of an embryo sac. So each ovule consists of an embryo sac. Now, this embryo sac is where the embryo is formed. Now, around this embryo sac or around the ovule are two protective layers called integuments. Now, the integuments, I'll tell you the function of this integument when we are done with the fertilization. After fertilization, I'll explain what this integument becomes. But there are two layers around the ovule. Now, the embryo sac contains the egg nucleus, that is the ovum, and two polar nuclei found at the center of the embryo sac. So inside the embryo sac, it contains the egg nucleus, that's the ovum, and two polar nuclei. Now, these two polar nuclei are found at the center of the embryo sac. Note this. The two polar nuclei that I'm talking about, they are found at the center of the embryo sac. That is their position. Then the last point that you need to know about the ovule is that there's a tiny opening in the surface of an ovule. That is what we call the micropyle. Now, this micropyle is at one end of the ovule through which pollen tube penetrates. So when we are looking at the double fertilization, you understand how come what are pollen tubes and what the micropyle looks like. So it's at that point in the ovule that pollen tube penetrates, what we call the micropyle. Now this micropyle is also essential for absorption of water when the seed is formed. We'll look at that after fertilization has taken place. Okay. So let's look at the process of double fertilization. The process of double fertilization. Now, I'm hoping that you could see the diagram next to the process. So you look on the diagram, and when I'm reading out, you compare and know where okay. You compare with what you can see, what I'm saying from the process. So you compare. Now looking at the diagram, you have pollen grain, the stigma, style, pollen tube, polar nuclei, female egg nucleus, male nuclei, pollen tube nucleus, micropyle, integument, then ovary wall, embryo sac. So you compare with it and know the process. Now, as I said, it's a process. So when you miss one step, the next steps are all wrong. Okay. Now the process starts after pollination, as I said. When this mature pollen grains lands on a matured stigma, so when the pollen grain lands on a matured stigma, now the pollen grain, they absorb moisture. That is water and let me put it air. They absorb moisture and nutrients from the surface of the stigma, and it swells up. Now, at the point where it's swelling up, now the pollen grain has a nucleus. Now this nucleus of the pollen grain divides into two unequal daughter nuclei. So it divides into two unequal sized daughter nuclei. That is step 2. Step 3, the larger nuclei the larger nuclei is called the generative nucleus, and the smaller one is called the tube nucleus or pollen tube nucleus. So inside the mature pollen grain that has absorbed water and nutrients from the stigma for growth to occur, the nucleus of the pollen grain divides into two unequal sizes. The larger one is called the generative nucleus, and the smaller one is called the tube nucleus or the pollen tube nucleus. Step 4, the outer wall of the pollen grain ruptures. That is when after it swells up, the pollen tube, the outer wall of the pollen grain ruptures. It breaks open. Then a pollen tube protrudes through the stigma style to the ovary. So if you can see, there's a tube that is moving down to the ovary. Now that is what we call the pollen tube. So step 4, the outer wall of the pollen grain ruptures and the pollen tube protrudes through the stigma, style, and ovary. Step 5. Now as the pollen tube is moving down, it derives nutrients from the style for growth. So when the tube is going down, it picks up nutrients from the style for growth until it reaches the ovule. So from the point where it moves, protrudes through the stigma, through the style, till it gets to the ovule, it derives nutrients from the style for growth. Point 6. As the tube moves towards the ovule, the tube nucleus, that is the pollen tube nucleus, moves or occupies to the tip of the pollen tube. So the tube nucleus moves to the tip of the pollen tube, then followed closely by the generative nucleus. So when the tube is going down, then the tube nucleus will move to the tip of the pollen tube, then followed closely by the generative nucleus. Point 7. Now, during the growth of this tube, the generative nucleus divides into 2 male nuclei, as you can see there. So when the tube is going down and is obtaining nutrients from the star, undergoing growth, now the generative nucleus, that's the larger nucleus, divides into 2 male nuclei. Point 8. Upon reaching the ovule, now the tip of the tube dissolves into the ovule. Okay. So the other male nucleus, as I was saying, fuses with the 2 polar nuclei found at the center of the embryo sac to form a primary endosperm nucleus, that is PEN. So the primary for P, the endosperm for E, and the nucleus for N. Now this primary endosperm nucleus later develops into the endosperm, provides nourishment for the embryo. We'll get to that. Now the process whereby the male nucleus fuses with the egg or the ovum to form a zygote, and the other male nucleus fusing with the 2 polar nuclei to form a primary endosperm nucleus is what we refer to as double fertilization in flowering plants. Now, as I said, you can refer to the one where the male nuclei fuses with the egg nucleus to form a zygote as the diploid fusion. Then with the fusion of the male nuclei and the 2 polar nuclei forms the triploid triploid fusion, that is 3 fusion, or triple fusion. Let me use that way. So the fusion of the egg with the male nuclei is double fusion. Then the fusion of the male nuclei and 2 polar nuclei is triple fusion. So this is the process of fertilization that we have in flowering plants. Let me go over one more time. Let me read over one more time so that you watch the video, then we come back to it. So step 1. When the matured pollen grains lands on the stigma, matured stigma, it absorbs moisture and nutrients from the surface of the stigma and swells up. Step 2. The nucleus of the pollen grain divides into 2 unequal sized daughter nuclei. Point 3. The larger nuclei is called the generative nucleus, and the smaller one, the tube nucleus or the pollen tube nucleus. Point 4. The outer wall of the pollen tube ruptures, and the pollen tube protrudes through the stigma style towards the ovary. Point 5. This pollen tube derives nutrients from the style for growth until it reaches the ovule. Point 6. As the tube moves towards the ovule, the tube nucleus occupies the tip of the tube, followed closely by the generative nucleus. Point 7. During the growth of the tube, the generative nucleus divides into 2 male nuclei. Point 8. On reaching the ovule, the tip of the tube dissolves with the tube nucleus, leaving the 2 male nuclei when it passes through the micropore into the embryo sac. Point 9. One of the male nucleus fuses with the egg nucleus, that's the ovum, forming a zygote, double fusion. Then point 10. The other male nucleus fuses with the two polar nuclei, forming the primary endosperm nucleus. That is triple fusion. Okay. So we are going to watch a video of how this double fertilization takes place or occurs. Okay. Now you can alert me if you are having any difficulty. I'm going to play the video twice. The person speaking is it's from India, so you should know how their accent looks like. So take your time and try and listen to what she's saying. Okay, so it's the same thing as what I said, but she'll be mentioning other things that it's not too required in what we are doing, but it's equally important. Okay.
To understand the process of fertilization in flowering plants, let us first see all the floral parts. Thalamus or receptacle provides the attachment place for the different floral whorls. Sepals make the outermost whorl. They protect the flower during the bud stage. Petals are generally brightly colored to attract insects for pollination. Anther and filament make the male reproductive part of the flower known as stamen. Stigma, style, and ovary make the female reproductive part. Or the pistil. In the ovary are ovules. In an
Okay, hold on for me. Let me try something else.
understand the process of fertilization in flowering plants, let us first see all the floral parts. Thalamus or receptacle provides the attachment place for the different floral whorl.
Okay, then let me try different alternatives. Please hold on for me.
Okay.
Let me use. I don't know whether it's from the PowerPoint. Okay. Please, can you see or
Understand the process of fertilization in flowering plants.
No, I think that you have to reshare your screen and share the video because we still see the PowerPoint.
Okay. I hope you can see this one.
Yeah.
Well,
Floral parts. Thalamus or receptacle provides the
It's very fine now.
To understand the process of fertilization in flowering plants, Let us first see all the floral parts. Thalamus or receptacle provides the attachment place for the different floral whorls. Sepals make the outermost whorl. They protect the flower during the bud stage. Petals are generally brightly colored to attract insects for pollination. Anther and filament make the male reproductive part of the flower known as stamen. Stigma, style, and ovary make the female reproductive part called the pistil. In the ovary are ovules. In an ovule is an embryo sac, and in the embryo sac is an egg. During pollination, the pollen grain comes to lie on the stigma. The pollen grain has two layers. The outer layer is known as exine, and it is made up of a substance called sporopollenin. The inner layer is thin and is known as intine. At some places, exine is thin. These areas are known as germ pores, through which will emerge the pollen tube. Pollen grain has two cells. The smaller cell is known as generative cell, which will divide to form two male gametes. The larger cell is known as the tube cell, which will give rise to the pollen tube. The embryo sac has three cells towards chaliza. These cells are known as antipodals. There are two nuclei in the middle called the polar nuclei. Three cells are towards the micropyle. The middle, larger cell is known as the egg. Two smaller cells are called the synergids. The egg and the two synergids would form the egg apparatus. The pollen tube emerges from the germ pore. The haploid generative cell divides to form two male gametes. The pollen tube enters the embryo sac through the micropyle. It enters through the degenerating synergid or between the egg and the synergid. The first male gamete fuses with the egg to form a diploid zygote. This process is known as fertilization. The second male gamete fuses with two polar nuclei to form a triploid endosperm nucleus, which will change into endosperm cell. The fusion of three nuclei is known as triple fusion. Endosperm will divide later on to form nutritive tissue, which will provide nourishment to the developing embryo. The process of fertilization and triple fusion together is called double fertilization.
Okay, so I'll repeat it again so that those who didn't hear what she said well, you would have the second view of it.
To understand the process of fertilization in flowering plants, let us first see all the floral parts. Thalamus or receptacle provides the attachment place for the different floral whorls. Sepals make the outermost whorl. They protect the flower during the bud stage. Petals are generally brightly colored to attract insects for pollination. Anther and filament make the male reproductive part of the flower known as stamen. Stigma, style, and ovary make the female reproductive part called the pistil. In the ovary are ovules. In an ovule is an embryo sac, and in the embryo sac is an egg. During pollination, the pollen grain comes to lie on the stigma. The pollen grain has two layers. The outer layer is known as exine, and it is made up of a substance called sporopollenin. The inner layer is thin and is known as intine. At some places, exine is thin. These areas are known as germ pores, through which will emerge the pollen tube. Pollen grain has two cells. The smaller cell is known as generative cell, which will divide to form two male gametes. The larger cell is known as the tube cell, which will give rise to the pollen tube. The embryo sac has 3 cells towards chaliza. These cells are known as antiporals. There are 2 nuclei in the middle called the polar nuclei. 3 cells are towards the micropyle. The middle, larger cell is known as the egg. 2 smaller cells are called the synergids. The egg and the 2 synergids would form the egg apparatus. The pollen tube emerges from the germ pore. The haploid generative cell divides to form 2 male gametes. The pollen tube enters the embryo sac through the micropyle. It enters through the degenerating synergid or between the egg and the synergid. The first male gamete fuses with the egg to form a diploid zygote. This process is known as fertilization. The second male gamete fuses with 2 polar nuclei to form a triploid endosperm nucleus, which will change into endosperm cell. The fusion of 3 nuclei is known as triple fusion. Endosperm will divide later on to form nutritive tissue, which will provide nourishment to the developing embryo. The process of fertilization and triple fusion together is called double fertilization.
Okay, so that's that. If you have any question, yes.
Please, why did they refer to the generative nucleus as the smaller one?
It was a mistake being made.
Okay.
It was a mistake being made, and indeed I noticed that, but she was referring to as generative cell. I hope the slides are back, or
they are not.
No.
Okay. Okay, so we have the slides back. Now, after the fertilization that you've seen, what happens after this double fertilization? What do we see after this fertilization has occurred in flowering plant? Now, the first thing that you know is that after this double fertilization, the zygote formed from the double fusion, that is from the male nucleus and that of the egg, to form a zygote, develops into an embryo. That's the embryo. So the zygote develops, undergoes cell division to form what? Embryo. Now the primary endosperm nucleus, that is from the fusion of the male nuclei and that of the 2 polar nuclei, develops into the endosperm of a seed, which surrounds the developing embryo. So this primary endosperm nucleus develops into the embryo. It surrounds the developing embryo and provides its nourishment. I made mention of it earlier. Now, the micropyle. The micropyle persists as the same small hole that is there in a seed coat through which water is absorbed. I also made mention of that earlier. Then the oval of the flower develops into a seed. Now those 2 integuments around the oval becomes the seed coat. Those 2 integuments around the seed, the oval becomes the seed coat. Now the outer one becomes the tester, then the inner one becomes the tegmen. We look at the one when we are dealing with the seed. Then the ovary develops into the fruit. So note these 3 important things. The oval develops into a seed. Then the 2 integuments around the oval develops into the seed coat. The ovary also develops into the fruit. Then you have the petals, sepals, style, and stamen they wither off. That is, they fall off. More or less like they undergo a form of decay and they fall off. But in some flowers, they don't. The sepals, they remain and persist. Normally, this purpose. I know you know it before. Purpose. We would look at when we are treating fruits. We look at what that is.
Sorry.
When we are treating fruits. So this is what happens after fertilization has taken place. The zygote develops into the embryo. The endosperm develops, the primary endosperm nucleus develops into the endosperm, which provides nourishment for the embryo. The micropyle persists in the seed coat through which water is absorbed. The ovule develops into the seed. The two integuments around the ovule becomes the seed coat. The ovary develops into the fruit, and the sepals, petals, style, and stamen, they wither off or they fall off. But in some flowers, the sepals may persist and remain. And you see in other books, they form parachute-like structures. So we would end here. If you have any question, you can ask. If there's no question, in our next lesson, we'll look at formation of seed, as we have established here. Then formation of fruits. So we'll look at fruits and seeds. Formation of fruits and